So I'm Lesley Murray from the University of Brighton, and
I'm Kim Sawchuk from Concordia University in Montreal.
And we have come together to collaborate on this paper, which I must say is at its very early stages of development. So we're just going to do our best here. We've come together really through a common interest in generation. Me, I suppose, more so in terms of children's mobilities, and Kim more so in terms of older people's mobilities. And also in a kind of common interest in the intersections of mobilities and design. And that came through a project that we got underway around age-friendly cities. And that has developed into thinking through, really, how we go about doing comparative research. We got some feedback from a proposal we put forward, which from one of the research councils here in the UK, which asked us why we hadn't talked about how we were going to do the comparative research. So that really got us thinking about how we think that process through really systematically.
It also got us thinking to what they were actually demanding of us as well. So.
Yes, exactly. So we're thinking about comparing spaces and mobile spaces, and these are the two of the three spaces that we're comparing in this study. Shamrock Place in Montreal, and this is New Road in Brighton, which is an example that some of you might know about of shared space. And we were thinking about what we want to do, what we want to think about in terms of comparing those spaces. So kind of what the criteria were for thinking. For
Hi, Gerard. He's on a little tiny iPhone.
And we're thinking about, our criteria were thinking about spaces that had been recently designed. There were some design interventions in those spaces that were both mobile but also transient and places of settlement as well as mobility, so places of immobility. That they were street spaces, so that they were mobile in that way. The spaces also, what's quite important, and I'll talk about it a bit later, is that they contain benches. Benches is a key part of what we're doing because we're carrying out a bench study. And that the spaces were socially and culturally diverse. And also that there was a range of mobilities in those spaces, so that we made sure that they were kind of multimodal, but also that people used digital technologies in those spaces, and again we'll talk about that a bit later. And also that they're contested, very importantly, by different users. And so one of the key things that we're thinking about is how you bring together, how people come together in urban spaces, and what that means in terms of the types of encounters that go on in those spaces. So it was important to us to think about working also in this comparative study as different people and different researchers coming from different backgrounds, coming from different cultures, different places, with different histories. And so we're thinking about trying to find some common threads, common ideas, and we've already come up against various not obstacles, but just differences in terminology, especially. So we're thinking through that, and one of something that we've come up with against already is the idea of methodology and methods and what they mean in our different cultures, academic cultures. So we're thinking about similarities but also differences, and that's through the research process, but also in terms of working together. So this idea of comparison is about us working together and thinking how we do that.
Can I just read a quote on this crumpled piece of paper from a new book that's coming out on comparative practice by Joe DeVille over here, who brought it to my attention, who suggests that practicing comparison involves not a definitive fixing of the qualities of the world, but a holding steady just long enough for questions of difference and similarity to come on into view. Page 18. So, yeah.
Yes, thank you for that. So that's a good timing for that book to be coming out. So we're thinking about inequalities. This comparative study is about inequality in mobile spaces and uneven mobility. So we started to think through, in relation to this idea of comparison, first of all about uneven spaces, and drawing from David Harvey and Doreen Massey, and thinking about time and space as being relational and inseparable. So we think about relationality and what that means in terms of ontology in the mobilities field, and thinking that within mobile methodologies, that I think we're quite attentive to that idea about that kind of ontological relationship between time and space, but thinking maybe less so in terms of epistemologies. And so our thinking, and this might be quite contentious here, is that in mobile methodologies there's more likely to be a privileging of space over time. And so we started to think through that and what that means. Thinking about geographers like Massey contesting the privileging of time over space, where spatial immobility triumphs temporal becomings. And so for Massey, space is not reliant on time, but is processual and is a product of connections and interrelations. So that was our kind of first thinking, drawing from scholars like Doreen Massey, thinking about the way that space is privileged over time, and I think we take that through into our epistemological approaches within mobile methodologies.
And the other thing that I think is important is that this becomes extraordinarily important when we're thinking of issues of gender and generation, but also processes of aging. So again, thinking about space in relationship to time, Harvey argues that space is not a container, of course, but in relationship to time, it's constituted through multiple processes, and in turn remakes these processes. So this is what we're thinking about when we're approaching these two areas, but also we're working with a third researcher who's not represented here yet because she hasn't had the time to become completely involved, Paulo Giron from the University of Santiago de Chile. So again, through the conversations of even trying to constitute sort of a series of case studies in these different locations, you become attentive not just to the politics of location, but things like temporal differences, because Paula and I are in the same time zone, and Brighton is in another time zone. So we kind of form a research triangle in a sense that is making us aware of this sort of latitudinal and longitudinal challenges and differences in relationship to the kind of very simple, what we saw at first as a kind of desire to do a simple comparison between these two different locations and the ways that generations and genders move through them. So at the same time that social researchers are acknowledging, social scientist researchers are again trying to re-acknowledge a temporal turn and argue for this, which is based on a decoupling, we think, of time again from space and a consequent privileging of time over space, which points, we think, to the need to attend how temporality is conceived and what this might have in terms of an implication for how we understand mobilities. For example, the distinct methodological paradigm of qualitative longitudinal research, which tries to take up time, or QLR study, is premised on what they say as a greater time perspective. Considerations of time and temporality have always been, we think, integral to thinking in the mobilities field, and we can point to Tim Creswell's work and John Urey's work, amongst others. And in a recent issue of Mobilities, the journal, Anderson discusses the ways in which jet lag, for example, disrupts the rhythms of time and space. While in a recent paper on the conceptual arsenal of QLR, Julie McLeod uses the experience again of jet lag to illustrate the notion of the untimely, the disjuncture of time from its normative linearity. So drawing from Armitage's notion of transtemporality, McLeod advocates taking what she calls a long view of time as a continuum rather than politically distributed into epochs or periods which privilege particular narratives over others. Of course, there are examples of longitudinal research that use mobile methods, including Ross's 2009 longitudinal study of everyday lives of groups of children in care. However, from both mobile methodologies and the QLR perspective, we are trying to investigate to see the ways in which people behind these stories are often left behind. So the contentions in the research that we're developing is that by bringing together mobile and comparative methodologies which are attentive to both the intersections and the interconnections between temporal and spatial dimensions, that we might make visible the connections between gender, generation, and mobile inequality.
So we're also mindful of where we are in terms of mobile methodologies, and thinking through what's happened already in order to kind of situate this comparative study. And so of course, there's been numerous studies, both preceding and since the call for methodologies and methods that are mobile in the mobilities paradigm, Mimi and John's paper on the mobilities paradigm paper. But these methodologies were firmly situated as an extension rather than something very new to existing methodological paradigms. But they very much stressed the everyday. That's what was kind of different about them. They stressed the being there and the social and political constitution of mobile practices, including, very importantly, embodied practice. And one of the kind of key messages of the book that I was involved in Mobile Methodologies, was this emphasis on understanding social inequalities and spatial unevenness. So that's something that we're very much taking, and of course that was also very evident in other publications on mobile methodologies, but that's something we're taking through here with our interest in gender and generation. And this interest in gender and generation that we're kind of concentrating on here is about also making visible other mobility injustices within public space. So we're not kind of stopping at gender and generation, but we're thinking that when we kind of focus on those, that makes visible other inequalities and other injustices. So there's been critiques as well of what's gone on within mobile methodologies. Peter Merriman's paper, for example, asking for a rethinking of mobile methods and calling for a range of performative, participative and ethnographic techniques that enable researchers to more effectively move or be seen with their research subjects and objects. I think what Merriman does is remind us that we should always be rethinking our methodological, our mobile methodologies, and so that's something that we're doing here. And also, I think what comes out quite strongly from his paper is this call for working across disciplines in a transdisciplinary way, and especially with reference to arts and humanities as well as social science. And that's something that I took up in a co-edited collection with Sarah Upstone, who's a literary scholar, in thinking about the kind of transdisciplinary aspects, particularly, and again, in understanding inequality and injustice. And in that book, so we overlaid the politics of mobilities and post-colonial theory, for example.
Okay, so I'm going to speak a little bit about gendering. Being attentive to the gendering of generations of mobility, there are a number of intersectional methodologies that can, of course, be called upon. Feminist methodologies are premised on the understanding that research should be grounded, or it should be grounded in women's experience. Studied engendered mobilities tend to draw from such perspectives in, for example, considering the mobility cultures of mothering. Feminist methodologies also call for a focus on the experience and feeling subject at the center of all intellectual endeavor, on the embodied aspects of social experience. And here I'm particularly influenced by Shayla Sandoval's methodology of the oppressed, which also links, I think, and has much to say to mobility scholars interested in notions of differential mobilities. Mobile methodologies have drawn from a range of existing methodological approaches, particularly anthropology. And here we think of Sarah Pink's work in adopting multisensory methods, while the work of researchers from within music and soundscape studies, including Andrew McCarthy, Owen Chapman, and Sam Tulin, who's here, have drawn our attention not only to the visual, but of how our ears and listening practices may play a key role in assisting us both in navigating through spaces, for comprehending a sense of place and its rhythms and temporalities, but also by placing an emphasis on listening practices. Particular methods, such as audiovisual methods, including audio and visual recording, may facilitate in the exploration of mobile emotions, but as well we need to be attentive of the power dynamics and relations that attend the use of any kind of technology within a particular location. Particular methods allow sometimes these emotionalities to emerge in a way that's not possible using strictly quantitative methods. In-depth interviews may allow participants to explore aspects of mobilities and to maintain control of the affective dimensions of this process.